the official policy or position of Universal Broadcasting Network.
You're listening to The Dr. D Show about neuropsychology and well-being. Get the knowledge you must have to live a powerful, positive life. The Dr. D Show. Here for you.
Welcome, listeners, to the Dr. D Show. Today, we are blessed to have you with us. The topic of today is one that has been repeated periodically on the show. It's traumatic brain injury. It is one of my specialties in which I'm published in, and I do cognitive rehabilitation in this area, but also an area that is in growing interest due to the numbers rising of the various kinds of injuries that we see individuals go through, whether it is vehicle accidents. We have military in the past few years related to war. We have various kinds of accidents that have to do with increase in sports for children and various kinds of activities that individuals take. And there is an increased awareness to the potential impact on the brain. So we're very excited to have today an interview with Lindy Michaelis.
Close enough. It's Michaelis.
Michaelis. Yes. I'm saying it wrong. Okay. So, sorry about that.
That's okay.
And we're very excited to have you on because you have a very special story and you have a very special experience and a very knowledgeable one that hopefully a lot of listeners will be able to benefit from today. Mm-hmm. With your permission, I am going to go through the disclaimers, the regular disclaimers. This show is psychoeducational in essence. It is not meant to replace professional mental help. And so if you do suffer from a particular problem, please do reach out for help. Also, some of the topics that we cover are not appropriate for the younger population, so your discretion is advised. With that, I'm going to go through the bio of Lindy so you can know just a little bit about Lindy and about what we'll be talking about today. Lindy divides her life into before and after a single date, June 19, 2001. Before this date, she was a wife, mother, singer, and fitness instructor, and life was smooth sailing. She was born into an entertainment environment and as the second daughter of singer-entertainer Pat Boone, which we all love, and grew up in Beverly Hills. She has one older sister, Cherry, and two younger sisters, Debbie and Lori. Am I pronouncing it right?
Correct.
Good. Growing up in Beverly Hills, California, was filled with beauty and affluence. Her parents raised their four daughters with structure and a tie to their roots in Nashville, Tennessee, working hard to demonstrate that this family was just like any other, even though tourists would drive by the family home to take pictures. It's a hard balance to keep. When Lindy and her sisters were approaching their teens, they started to join their father and mother on stage, and their harmonies were well received and allowed a strict dad to keep a closer eye on daughters, beautiful daughters, as they approached the dating years. Did your dad pull out all the swords? And
he was a bit intimidating when we got to dating age.
I'm sure, as every good father would be. They toured all over the U.S. and internationally. The Boone Girls recorded several Christian albums, including First Class, which was nominated for a Grammy Award. Amazing. And Lindy is a mother to Ryan, Jessica, and Tyler. She has been happily married to Michaelis for 26 years, who is the stepdad to her first two children from her first marriage, to Doug Corbin. She never pursued a full-time career of her own, but being a mother is a full-time career in a way, but has worked part-time at her hobbies, allowing her to work a schedule around her family. She's found that being a fitness instructor was a great fit since it involved music and being up in front of a group with a microphone. She has been working in the fitness industry for 2 decades and continues to enjoy teaching a variety of formats. And I always talk on the show about the importance of music and creativity and self-expression. And I think in a way that is one of the best rehabilitations for people. As her children got older, she joined another singing group in 1995, and this group made up of 3 other women, so she felt right at home singing with them. They performed the songs of the original, and how do you pronounce this?
The Chordettes.
Thank you. The Chordettes, popular in 1950s and include songs from the 40s and 60s as well. They sing with the tight harmonies, and she enjoyed singing with her sisters. Now, for the topic of today. In June 19, her life changed radically. Her oldest son, Ryan Corbin, stepped on a skylight on the roof of his apartment building, which broke, and he fell 3 stories to the concrete below. For the last 10 years, Lindy has learned a lot more about brain injury than she ever cared to know, but has learned a lot about the faithfulness of God along the way. The Boone family started a foundation called Ryan's Reach, in Ryan's name, to help the survivors of brain injury and their families. Lindy works all year on, and I know how much work you put into this just a bit, on fundraising events to bring awareness to traumatic brain injury and how it affects families, to offer hope that this catastrophic event that families go through can be survived by the families and that progress is possible long after the date of injury, and to provide funding so that some with traumatic brain injury can attend a nonprofit head injury program in Tustin, California called High Hopes. Lindy,
Yes.
how would you begin? How would you like to begin describing your experience?
Well, it certainly is a life-altering experience. It's something that until you have a trauma, a bomb go off in your family is the way it felt, you really can't identify with someone who has. And so it was a shock to my family. I especially to me, I had a very carefree life up until that point. I was 45 years old, and I really had general problems, nothing really major. So this is the kind of thing you see on the news. It doesn't happen to you personally. And so when it did, it felt very surreal. And it took days and weeks and months really to process what had happened and how life had changed so dramatically.
And you're touching on a very important point. A lot of families describe that the effect is beyond just the person's injury, but all the family members and their lifestyles and the hopes and dreams that now are being altered, and then where to get help and services, even technical information, which I think part of what I would like to do today is give some of that information at least out there. So if someone knows someone that needs help or is just going through this, can just have the level of awareness of where they can begin to get help. But before we get there, so you immediately find out that this horrific thing happens.
I was on vacation on June 19th, 2001. I was awakened by a phone ringing in the dark at 5 a.m. probably at that time. And I was disoriented being in a condo in Spain. So we were at a timeshare. My youngest son, my husband, and I had spent about 4 days. We had a few days to go. And a rude awakening. I thought I was dreaming the phone ringing, and then I realized, no, it's ringing, but where is it? It's dark. I'm not in my familiar surroundings, and it seemed far away. And so I started to ricochet off the walls looking for this phone. And then I heard my sister Debbie's voice, and I knew this can't be good. To track me down halfway around the world, I thought I better brace myself. And her voice was very somber, and she said, Lindy, it's Ryan. And my stomach just went into knots, and I just kind of held my breath. And she explained, he fell. He did not have a car accident. He fell. He and his roommate were going up to the roof of the apartment building they lived in, which I knew was a 3-story building. And their intent was to get some sun in the afternoon. I guess the pool had been covered over by shadows. And so they went up to the roof, and he was stepping across a skylight that was flush with the roof. I believe he might have seen it, but I'm not sure he saw it. But his roommate describes that his foot came down in the corner of it, and it gave way, breaking, and he just vanished through the skylight, which was over an atrium in the courtyard, over a courtyard. So he hit the railings going down on the second and the first story, which I think was a blessing. It probably slowed the speed of his fall, but he fell onto concrete and just totally rattled every part of his body, every internal organ, cracked ribs. Didn't break a bone other than he had a skull fracture. He did break his jaw, but everything else was just damaged. and he was unconscious and labored to breathe. His lungs collapsed. His spleen burst in the fall. And all this was what I learned later after I got finally to the hospital. He was near UCLA Hospital. His roommate thankfully was with him and could call 911. But my parents, who live in Beverly Hills, were called. My mother arrived at UCLA at the emergency room right as the paramedics were coming back out after dropping Ryan off. And she said, "That was my grandson. How is he?" And the paramedic just said, "Don't get your hopes up." So that was the word that she heard. And at this point, I was still sleeping, sound asleep in Spain. So this has been, that was the start of a long journey. It's actually been 14 years this June. My bio is a little old. I said 10 years, it's been nearly 14. And we've learned a lot. We've come very far with Ryan, and we're still, traveling that road. But that day was just a turning point for me. I really do figure out my life based on, was it before or was it after the accident? And I go back 14 years ago and I can figure it out from there.
It must have been such a difficult flight home.
It was unbearable. It felt unbearable because it was actually 3 flights. We had to fly from Malaga to Madrid, across the Atlantic. That was the very hard one. And then from Miami to L.A. But the 8 hours across the ocean, I couldn't have any contact with home.
Yeah, you couldn't
And
call.
he was, I knew he was in surgery or in the, ICU. And I had heard they were trying to get a CAT scan of his brain, but they couldn't because he was so fragile. Every time they tried to move him to get the CAT scan, he couldn't breathe on his own, and he couldn't sustain the kind of breathing apparatus that was trying to do the breathing for his lungs. So they would have to rush him back to
They
the
had to
ICU.
stabilize him first.
Right. So I knew this was so serious when I heard that. And so flying on the plane, it started to become more and more real. At first, you go into some sort of shock. You can't process what you've been told. You just get busy packing and making your way home. But on the plane, I started to look at the people that were laughing and enjoying the movie and eating their meal.
It's
and
surreal.
I felt like, don't they understand that this is not a good day? This is a horrible day, that something horrible has happened. And I wanted to scream. It just didn't feel right to see everybody going about their normal lives. And so I had this inspiration that I needed to write. And I started scrambling. I didn't have pen or paper, but my husband had some paper. He said I could have the back of it, and I had to scrounge a pen off of somebody. And I just started writing my feelings and writing my thoughts and really a prayer. It was just praying, but pouring out every emotion to God and asking for strength, asking for wisdom, and most of all, asking for this pain not to be for no reason.
And you're talking about 14 years from the time of accident, but these are the years that have been probably so filled with your own process through how it is to care for someone you love so much and try every way possible to provide them with what they need in order to get out of this kind of a situation and be able to receive something from it. And then for the rest of the family, may I ask you, how did the rest of the family feel, and how did they deal with it? You mentioned prayer, which is something very important, and you found, it sounds like for you it was almost innate to be able to process it on paper, and that's a blessing by itself. But I think that different people react differently to situations like that.
Well, we grew up a faith family. We were taught to believe in something bigger than ourselves. And it became an individual experience for each of us in the family. So we believe in a personal relationship with God. And I was never so grateful for knowing that prayer is something that I could utilize to touch Ryan, because I was halfway around the world. And I knew it would take time, but I knew God was with me. I knew God was with Ryan. And this was a conduit by which I could affect the situation. And so my husband and my son and I held hands and we prayed in our little condo in Spain before we did anything, and just prayed for the doctors, prayed for the nurses, prayed for my son, prayed for getting the flights home and for things to go smoothly. And there's a comfort in that, but I also believe that there's a power in that.
Absolutely. What did you find shortly after the accident? What did you find that was useful and helpful to you as being on as in the side of the family of the person who's injured?
Well, what we did as a family is just came together in the waiting room and pretty much set up camp. And the comfort to me was having the family around us. I was very comforted by my parents being there. My mother just set up camp, never left. I mean, she lives 5 minutes away, so eventually I started sleeping over at the house that I grew up in, and would just get back to the hospital as soon as I could to be near my son. But they wouldn't let us be in his room all the time. He was in ICU. So we just wanted to be near, and
Sure.
we wanted to go in and check on him, and we wanted to be where the doctors could find us easily. And my sister Debbie came every day, and she brought her hymnal, and we sang, and we did jigsaw puzzles, and that became very symbolic to me while we sat. We were in the waiting room there every day for about 6 weeks before they moved him out of ICU into another facility. And we would just sit there and do jigsaw puzzles, and I would say, this is what it's gonna be like with Ryan. We're gonna find piece by piece, things are gonna fit together again. Because we were told first he wasn't gonna probably live, and then we were told he was probably going to be in a vegetative state, and that he would recover, that his lungs would recover. I mean, eventually these things started to show signs that they'd turned the corner, and his kidneys were going to be all right, and all these various organs were going to recover, but the brain was this big unknown. And so he was in a deep coma, non-responsive. They took all the medications that had put him kind of under sedation for a while, but as they lifted them, he did not wake up. He opened his eyes, but he was just staring. So we had this great unknown. We knew it was going to be a long road. And so we did these jigsaw puzzles, and I kept believing that we're going to keep finding pieces of the puzzle, and they're going to fit. And the image of Ryan is going to emerge little by little.
It's actually an excellent example, because in a way that is what happens after recovery from either a moderate or severe brain injury. It is like pieces of a puzzle, and it's also for the medical team to a large extent pieces of a puzzle. And it really takes time and experience with the person's recovery process, and looking and examining to see how the brain of the person is attempting to recover as well. So there's something that we know called compensatory systems. And when the brain gets injured, various kinds of systems in the brain come together to sort of compensate for the functions that have been disrupted. And new neuronal connections are being created, hopefully to compensate as much as possible for some of the tasks that have been lost. And so part of what a medical team would do is also pay attention to that process and see around that time of the few months and a few years after recovery, how does the brain change with the injury. Why that is also an important and an opportunistic time for us on the medical side is because that is the time that you also want to get the brain stimulated within reason, but stimulated enough where you're telling the brain, I still need those tasks to be done, and I really want still some of those functions to be in effect. And so cognitive rehabilitation is important throughout the life of the individual, but definitely at a certain opportunistic times, such as right after the injury or shortly after, when a person recovers from or is awakened from coma. How long was Ryan in a coma?
Well, he emerged from it so gradually that you, I'm sure, have talked about the scale of coming out of a coma, just one level at a time. So he was on a path of slow emerging, but they didn't tell me that they didn't believe he was in a coma anymore until about 4 months. He was already doing a few things, but they said he was still in a coma. And the simple things that he could do, at about 3 months after his accident, he responded to his sister, who was holding out a little piece of chocolate pudding, a little bit of chocolate pudding on her finger, saying, "Ryan, don't you want to taste this pudding? It's chocolate." And with no expression on his face, and at this time he was moving his head just kind of repetitively without any purpose and a vacant expression on his face, but he stilled his head, he opened his mouth, she put her finger on his tongue, and he licked the pudding and swallowed. And that was very purposeful. That was the first sign that he heard us and that he had any sort of control to steady his head, open his mouth, and swallow. And that was the beginning of him taking a bite every so often. And it wasn't all the time. He didn't just start doing it. It was like maybe 2 more weeks, and then he might do it again once or 2 times. So very, very gradually, my dad, I think, probably discovered as he shook Ryan's hand that Ryan's hand could sort of move into a, the kind of handshake guys do where they shake regularly and they shift. And there were just about like 3 steps of this handshake that Ryan used to do with my dad and with his friends. And his body remembered that, even though he was still considered in a coma. But the most beautiful thing, at just about 4 months, his dad came in to where we were sitting in the waiting room at, I think, the 4th hospital he was in. And he said, "I think Ryan just kissed me." And he said, "I leaned over and I kissed his cheek, and Ryan's head turned and I felt him kiss my cheek." Now, he still had no expression on his face, but we all said, "Well, we've got to go see if this is true." And we all lined up, and oh my goodness, there's a picture in my book of me getting a kiss for the first time after about 4 months.
Oh, wow.
And if you want to see the definition of joy and bliss, that's that picture.
They have to buy the book.
They have to get Heaven Hears. But yes, that was still, he was considered in a coma, but his head would turn and he'd kiss us back. So after he wasn't in a coma, they said, "Well, we don't think he's in a coma because his eyes are tracking as somebody walks across the room." But he couldn't do anything in response to a request. If you said, "Ryan, can you blink for yes?" He couldn't do that. "Could you squeeze my finger?" He couldn't do that. So it was very slow before we heard that he could form a word. That was 7 months later that his first word, without sound, could even be formed. Wow. We started seeing little mouth movements that looked like words, and then we started to realize, oh, he's saying mom, or he's saying bye, and or nodding his head affirmatively. So we started to have communication at about 7 months.
It's a point to make about gradual and slow recovery to certain kind of functions that you would naturally would expect them to be there, but the expectation is being augmented. But Ryan, in a way, is also a story of a miracle that you and I talked about previously. Could you share with us, really, how do you see it?
I see Ryan as a miracle in progress. So just because he hasn't just gotten up and started walking, to me, that doesn't negate all the many miracles along the way. And I see them still, and it's been a long time, but I still see just this fabulous emerging. Sometimes he'll say something that sounds so natural and comes out so Ryan. And he has so much slang now. He has so much humor now. He has his voice back, his appetite back. He has so much that's returned. And he has, in some ways, a lot of good common sense and reasoning. Not in every way, but in a lot of ways. So we're very joyful. And the fact that we were told, don't expect, even if he comes out of a coma, don't expect that the right and the left side of the brain are going to communicate, because it was explained to us that there was a severing of the corpus callosum, and that it would be very rare for him to be able to have right side, left side communication. So,
though we do know scientifically there are children that are born also without corpus callosum that have communication between the right and left.
So they told us the worst case scenario when we
right.
braced
They
ourselves.
They wanted to be
Yeah.
keep it more conservative.
Right.
But the brain is fascinating,
Yeah.
and so I think that's a very important. I mean, to me, to have the privilege to work with people who their brain changes and their brain is irregular, okay, in various kinds of levels. You also, on my side, are humbled by the things that you can see that a person can do with their brain. And so while we talk about some limitations of the person, the correct approach is to also know that technically so many things are still possible. And if you set it this way, then you always make a room and an opportunity for incredible things to happen.
Yes, I always am careful with what I say. And when people ask me, well, what if the doctors said, what's the prognosis? And I always have to say, well, he's so far beyond what the doctors ever told me would be possible that I don't put limits on Ryan because he's already gone so far beyond the limits that we were told to expect that I'm not going to say, well, I guess he's about as far as he's going to go. I'm not going to do that. And I really firmly believe in the power of what we say. And I don't have a lot of science to back it up, but my life backs it up. And I believe very strongly that a lot of negativity in speech can bring negativity in your life. And so we speak life over Ryan. We speak recovery over Ryan. And that's what I tend to dwell on. When I report how Ryan's doing, I think of the latest wonderful thing that's happened.
And there is research support to that. So there's actually emerging everyday scientific evidence that talks about the power of the word. The research that was done with water that we talked about in the past, and when you talk to water, what happens to the molecules and how they change.
Yes.
I firmly believe that we are, and I am a researcher and a scientist, and I still firmly believe science is catching up with some of the things we know internally could happen, and some of the spiritual beliefs that we have, rather than feeling sometimes like the spiritual world is trying to catch up with science. And again, I think the correct approach is to see the positive psychology, is to see the effect of how we treat people and each other, and how to see the power of energy around us. And we know it from other fields in chemistry and biology, the power of energy. Energy is harnessed, it's transferred, it's never quite lost. So when you think about positive energy, at the same time you need to be wary of the negative energy and just pay attention to how that affects your life.
So early on, I felt like I needed to always look, and I'm not a journaler, but I did have to journal during this whole experience. It was the way to process my grief. It was the way to process my emotions. And I needed to list everything I had to be grateful for. And that's really important if I'm, able to share that message with people going through traumatic experience. If you can, and it's difficult, but if you can take your focus onto what you have to be grateful for, it's going to change a lot of your internal coping mechanisms. The frequencies of what you're putting out there affect everything around you. And so gratitude is such a huge thing. And I saw my list get longer and longer and longer of things I had to be grateful for. But at first I had to look. I had to really struggle. Oh, he can swallow. I was grateful because I saw people that were drooling. And I could be so grateful that Ryan, with all that brain damage and all the coma and everything, he wasn't drooling, and I could say I'm grateful he can swallow. So those are the kinds of things that, I was looking for. I was grateful that he wasn't alone when he fell. That's a huge thing, that somebody could call 911.
Very true.
If he'd been alone, it would be a whole different story.
And it's challenging. What you're describing is such a challenging thing to do. So by no means do we ever feel that process is an easy process. And standing to the side of a person that has gone through these kind of challenges it's a tremendous thing, and yet you are giving an important message, I think, which is we must force ourselves to look for the good, and when we do that enough, we can find that good. I
used to pray over Ryan, but I couldn't form the words. and I would just put my hand on him, and I would speak what I wanted to see return. And mostly I spoke voice, and I would speak appetite. And I just spoke it as if I'm speaking that into existence. And that was a powerful thing, I think. I didn't miss a night. Every night I would go in and pray with him, for him. He had no voice. He had a feeding tube. But now he prays out loud, and he speaks to his own brain. He puts his hand on his brain, and we speak the things to his body, to his brain that we want to see manifest. And I'm watching them come back. And it's not in my time frame. I'd like it to have happened already, all, completely. But I'm watching it happen bit by bit, jigsaw puzzle piece, one at a time.
It's incredible, and I would like to perhaps expand on the concept of giving and being able to look, having that gratitude is also in a way allowing the opportunity to give other people who may not have that ability. So maybe we can talk a little bit about how Ryan's Reach was incepted and what is Ryan Reach about?
About a year and a half after Ryan's accident, we started to realize that there was an enormous amount of goodwill being sent our way. And that's because my dad is Pat Boone. There's so many people who are fans of his around the world, and his career has spanned 60 years. And at that time, it had been 50 years, so still a long time. And we were asked to be on Larry King Live several times. And while we were on that program, it went out to 220 countries. People would write emails to us and just tell us how much they were moved by our story, how much they cared about Ryan and were praying for him. And there was such gratitude in our hearts for all these people that cared that it eventually became clear that it wasn't to be just for us alone, that somehow we needed to harness that goodwill and see how we can generate goodwill out towards others. Ryan was blessed because he was able to receive a settlement, which has allowed us to have lots of therapy and caregivers to help us take care of him. And that set us free to pursue Ryan's Reach, which is a foundation that we started to raise money. And as we thought about how we wanted to spend the money that we would raise, we felt that the best use of our money at that time would be to provide scholarships for people with traumatic brain injury to attend High Hopes Head Injury Program in Tustin, California. Ryan was already attending and receiving some wonderful therapy there. And it's a place that people find themselves after insurance has decided you're not getting better fast enough, and therefore we're cutting off your insurance. And this happens a lot with brain injury. It's a slow go for many of the people that are surviving a brain injury. Sometimes it's fast, and as long as it's moving along, insurance continues to pay. But if you end up having a bit of a slowdown or plateau for a short time, they decide, okay, we are not going to keep paying for therapy. And a lot of families can't do it out of pocket. And so this is probably why you're told early on that the bulk of the recovery you're going to see after a severe brain injury will happen in the first maybe 2 years. You're told that. And so as a mother, you're thinking, I need to get as much therapy in as possible in this first 2 years. And you panic a little bit as those 2 years comes to an end because you think, is this all there's going to be? Well, we've been able to continue therapy with Ryan well beyond the time when insurance decided there wasn't any more to accomplish. Mm-hmm. And because we've been able to keep the therapy going and the stimulation going, his progress has continued to go. And we've been able to help other people in that predicament where they don't have insurance anymore. They've mortgaged their homes. They've done everything they know to do. And so we are able to provide scholarships for various people over the last, actually it's been about 12 years since we started Ryan's Reach. And they attend High Hopes Head Injury Program, which is already nonprofit. The costs are as low as they're going to get. And they still are too much for most families.
Sure.
So they provide all kinds of physical therapy, cognitive therapy, water therapy, and many things. So we've been honored to do that. And our latest endeavor is to start a group home. First, to provide respite care for families that are exhausted, that never get a break, and eventually to provide residence, because there's just nothing in our area anyway where brain injury survivors can
afford even staying
Yes.
for a while.
Yes, for that, or to be a resident together in a group of people that have had a brain injury.
It's kind of an important point, I think, to share with our listeners that often, again, we hear the isolated event, but we don't hear about all the changes that families go through for years and years and years after an event. You talked about mortgaging the home. There are other crises in other families. You will see sometimes divorces.
Often.
People lose their job. People deal with pain and trauma differently. And the best approach is really not judgment rather than support. It's very important not to turn against each other in those kind of situations. You will see very painful things happen, like spouses turning against each other and throwing blame. Part of it is anger, it's frustration, it's not knowing who to be angry with.
And disagreements. This is something that we, my husband and I are very glad that we survived all the storms, but I can speak, and I did speak to it in my book because I wanted to be real. If you're going to read a story that's going to help you, it's got to be authentic, and people will relate more to the troubles that you might have and the disagreements you might have. So I tried to be very honest because there's going to be different opinions about the level of care, how many hours you can be away from your loved one. I felt that Ryan needed to have somebody in his room at all times, and my husband was more trusting of a hospital or a facility to take care of him. And that's very typical in a marriage. The man is going to be a little more willing to be away from the facility to do other things. Of course, the man is often at work. The mother might be the one that is able to stay and be at the bedside. But it was very hard to get me away from Ryan for any length of time. And thankfully, my mother shared that responsibility with me. And we both agreed that somebody needed to be in that room. You never know when you're going to need to call for help. Yes.
Right.
So.
And there are things like practical things like, difficulty with swallowing something, falling off a chair.
He coughed and his breathing tube popped off once or twice. And I thought, what if somebody wasn't there to bring attention to that? That's his air.
Right.
So those things didn't happen often. He had a seizure once, and thankfully somebody was there to call for help. And it just, they're very few and far between, but I always wanted to have somebody in the room with him. And my husband has been a blessing and an angel. We might have had some disagreements, but I couldn't have gotten through these years without his support in all that he has done to stand by his stepson, not even his blood, but he loves my son Ryan and as if he's his own. And I've been very lucky because I also have Ryan's father in our lives, and we all together, I love his wife, and all together we are parenting and going through this. And actually, we all four are very, very involved in Ryan's reach. So sometimes people don't understand how we've all gotten along, but it's been a blessing for Ryan for sure, and for all of us that we care about each other and pull together through this. And I couldn't have made it through without each one of them.
And it sounds like the focus has been about giving and producing positive things rather than focusing on each other or focusing on points that are not necessary. Often part of the therapy for families is to find a venue in which they can express themselves and utilize their energy in a positive, productive manner rather than internalizing it and digging into pain that becomes then more painful and might create a certain cycle that is not preferable. But I also think you kind of mentioned, and I wanted to touch on that, even for families who care for their loved ones, like a devoted mother, and you are a very devoted mother to Ryan, as I know, sometimes you need a break too. You need to replenish yourself too and get your energy back again and care for yourself so you can be there for him again.
It's a balance. I think that's where the disagreements can come up, because I felt like I'll know when I can leave him. I'll know. It's an internal thing. And as soon as I could, I did. I started to get a massage here and there, and that was wonderful. I was still grieving, and yet I could go and say, you know what, my body needs this relaxation. I am a fitness instructor, and I didn't continue to teach classes, but if I needed to go out for a run, I went out and I ran, because I needed to burn that stress off. It was very stressful to sit in a waiting room hours and hours. And Ryan was in 6 facilities over 10 months before we moved him home. So there was always a bit of another change. You know, we've got to take him out of this environment where I was starting to feel comfortable and now go into a new environment, and I don't know about this place or how they're going to take care of him. So there were always these, moving parts.
And adjustments.
Yes.
Constant adjustments.
Right. And yes, it takes a toll on the others. My daughter quit her job in San Francisco. She had just been doing quite well in her first endeavors, had graduated college, and had a show on television that she was part of that she had to quit, or she wanted to. But I wanted her to come home too. It was important to have the family together, and I needed help with my younger son. So she quit her job. She moved home. She kind of changed careers for a time. And that took a toll on her later. And she needed to be, her wounds and her, she stuffed a lot of her emotions during that time, trying to be the strong one to make sure that I was held up.
Sure.
And then my other son, Tyler, he kind of got lost in the shuffle a little bit. This happens also when the focal point is the one with the brain injury. And me, I'm gone. I'm in the hospital. And so I felt like, oh, that's okay. Tyler has his dad, and he has his friends, and he has his structure, his soccer. But it takes a toll. It's almost impossible for it not to. And so it shows up in the different people's lives. After Ryan, everybody was focused on me, trying to make sure I was going to be okay. And I wasn't even aware of how much people were trying to take care of me. So we just all had to be kind of focused on little by little when we could. I felt like it's kind of like a bomb going off, and you do triage and you see where the bleeding is the worst.
And then you treat.
And then you have to look back and see, okay, now I've got some time. I need to go back and focus over here. But I've been very blessed that having caregivers to help take care of Ryan. I wouldn't leave them alone with him for a very long time until I felt I really knew them and really trusted them. But eventually, I could go to the store. Eventually, I could go out at night. Eventually, I could go on a vacation. And so those are the things that I've been able to do to take care of myself. But I'm so aware of that being totally absent for other parents. And so that's kind of what drives us. Is I've been part of a support group, and I've watched people express, what's going to happen when I get too old to take care of my son? I'm getting old. I'm not sure I'm going to be able to keep this up. And so that's why we've started this home, and we want there to be a template, not just one home. We want this to succeed so that it can be a template to duplicate in other areas, because there's so many families like this.
And we see that in other situations as well, not just with traumatic brain injury, but at any scenario when you have a loved one who's vulnerable, who has limited ability, cognitive ability. It could be children with autism.
Absolutely.
It could be mild retardation or more severe retardation. Parents are facing the question of, when I get old, who's going to take care of my loved one? And they're going to outlive me, the likelihood. So I think that what you're incepting with Ryan's Reach and the home is extremely important, because the more that we have settings and situations and opportunities for people to, especially once it's financially are affordable, for people to find an arrangement for their loved one so they could be at some level of peace, that their loved one has a dignified life and protected life, is such an essential, important thing that we have yet to get a handle on socially and in the medical setting as well, I think that this is a major necessity. And these are the practicalities that sometimes you don't hear covered in media. You'll hear a lot about, when things happen, right? But what you fail to hear is about the after effect.
Right.
And the years and years and years later where care needs to be maintained. You also mentioned about the reality of insurance companies having a limited amount of time of care that's being provided and therapy that's being provided to the loved ones. But then what happens after 2 years, right? Then what? And so having other opportunities and possibilities and things that people can do and options they can have is still another area to work on. We talk about lives of many individuals and the quality of life that they will have. So this is quite tremendous. And when we talk about quality of life, we don't talk just about cognitive stimulation, but we talk about even the most basic thing, which is a person being content, being happy, being able to have some experiences that are simply fun. So just because someone is injured doesn't mean they don't have the opportunity and they don't experience actually laughing and connection. And in fact, we know that the areas in the brain that are responsible for emotional experiences, such as the amygdala, it's the core of the brain. Those ones many times are the last to go in an individual. We know that both with brain injury and dementia. And so one of the things we know that even if someone's ability to speak is being taken away from them, many times they still have quite of a capacity to feel.
And emotions.
An emotional capacity to feel. And so they can tell many times if a person likes them or not, if they're being loved or not and respected. That's a very important thing.
Absolutely. That's another thing that I've been so adamant that it's one thing for somebody to be able to take care of my son, Ryan, but he needs to be hugged. He needs to have somebody that adores him.
Yes.
So for 1 year, he had to be in Bakersfield we were working on behavior. He had some severe behavior, and it was recommended that he go be in a facility. Well, if he was in a facility, I needed to go be with him. And there was the argument that I should be home more and not in Bakersfield. But I wished that cloning was possible. I wished I could be in two places. I came home on the weekends and I was 5 days in Bakersfield. But my argument was that nobody there at this facility knew him. My other son knew where I was, and he had all the other support systems. But my son, Ryan, had no memory, so he'd wake up in the morning, not know anybody around him. He needed to see an anchoring face, somebody that he knew, and somebody that didn't, that he wasn't afraid of, and somebody that could wrap their arms around him, pray for him, and just care deeply. There's something about knowing that somebody in that room cares deeply, and I can't tell him enough. I adore you. I cherish you. You're the best. I'm so grateful you're here. And it's so wonderful for him to be able to talk back to me now. But in Bakersfield, he had hardly any words, but he had a lot of aggressive behavior. And if I wasn't around, the people taking care of him were getting hit maybe or bitten. And they needed to hear what a great guy he was from somebody that knew him.
Absolutely.
So.
And you kind of mentioned two important points that I'll touch on. One of them is just for our listeners. So when we talk about not knowing, part of the often the scenarios that we'll see is a loss of the ability to create new memories when you have an injury. And so the issue is that going into new environments, there is a short-term memory loss where the person is not able to hold on to new information, such as new faces, and then retain that information and store it in long-term memory so they can remember the next day who's that person they're talking to. So that failure to record it in short-term memory long enough in order for that to transfer to permanent memory makes the experience horrific for them, because the next day they wake up, brand new experience, brand new people, even though these are people that may have been taking care of them for months. And so that is one of the issues. While information that was retained prior to the accident or prior to the injury, such as knowing your parents, most of the times, in most of the cases, is retained because that information is already in long-term memory and many times has not been harmed. Not all the cases, but most cases. And so this is the realization we're talking about. The other one is the I will say from my experience with my clients, is that I see often and often, again and again, that if the family is very loving and supportive and patient with their injured family member, the client has more of an opportunity to do well and do better and perform better on cognitive rehabilitation and tasks that they receive, because they innately feel that their loved ones believe in them, that they know that they can do it. That type of encouragement, it's almost a feeling. It's sometimes not even verbal.
Right.
It's just the way that they feel they're being treated in the room and how people feel about them, especially the vulnerability that you have with family members. While I will see the opposite scenario that we don't generally want to see, which is, and it doesn't come necessarily from a bad place, but it comes from an uninformed place, is that family members maybe will pressure their loved one a lot and will push them a lot, which creates anxiety and stress and sometimes bad feelings. Oh, you should know that, or you used to know that.
Yeah.
It doesn't come from a bad place. It just comes almost from a frustrated place.
Right. And I get that way myself. And that's when I have to step back a little bit and let somebody else work with him, because I've seen him do well, and maybe on a different day he's not doing as well. And so it is frustrating for me because I want so much for him not to slip backwards. So when that happens, I kind of step aside and go, okay, Lindy, you take a time out and come back when you're in a better mood.
Right. But that's great to have that awareness and that insight to say, I think I'm getting too emotionally excited about this, or I'm getting impatient about it, or however the thing that you feel that you're experiencing, and being able to step back and say, I think I can give this to someone else to do it just for a little while. So, and I think that's why it's important to have a team of professionals to work with you, and find a team that works for you. So, when people say to me sometimes, well, I worked with one psychologist and it was a bad experience. And I always tell them, well, is every attorney the same? No. You're going to go to one attorney, you're going to work great with that person, and then there's another attorney you can't stand, right? I don't know, for some reason the example with attorneys work. But it is in every profession, in every field, right? There are going to be restaurants you like and restaurants you don't. It's the same thing with psychologists, with medical doctors, with therapists, with and we talk about physical therapy and speech therapy. You need to connect to the person that works well with your family, that you see has the well-being of your loved one in mind, and that they provide progress for your loved one. You also want to make sure that you get services that are supported to some extent in science. So while we all explore looking over the boundaries, the traditional boundaries, we also want to make sure that we're not wasting time and effort and funds, because we all have limited funds to some extent, on services that are not helpful to our loved ones. That's an important, and it's always the balance, right, between the hope that great things will happen and to continue with that hope, and at the same time to have a critical mind and say, do I think this is beneficial or not? And so, and actually, in a way, because we don't have a lot of time left, and time passes by so fast on this show, is to just maybe pick your brain just a little bit about the things that you found to be in your situation helpful to Ryan, and then things maybe that weren't so helpful.
Therapy-wise?
Yes.
Well, movement. If you can get the body moving. He's a 6'4" tall guy, and at the time of his accident he weighed 215 pounds. He's a lot lighter now, but it's hard to move a big body like that. But it was really important, and it always is important, to find ways to get the body moving. Even when he was in a coma, if you've got a loved one in a coma, you don't want them to just lay without movement. So there's various things as the body gets more stabilized that you can do, but at least bend and straighten the legs, and that's called range of motion, or working with the hands, trying to, maintain some, ability to open the hand. So movement, we were gifted a apparatus called a quadriciser, and it was something that he could sit on that would bicycle his legs, and his hands would be kind of attached to pulleys and move his arms and legs in opposition to each other. And we were told that that would be a good thing for his brain as well as his body, his circulation. So early on, it was all about movement and stimulation of music and touch and things that we provided for him without challenging him too much. Eventually, when he started to move his mouth, we started to sing songs and leave a word off. This was really helpful in getting him to start talking again, because automatically if I sang happy birthday to, he'd want to hear that you. So he would mouth you. And I started realizing this is how we're going to get his lips moving again. So he was so into music, it wasn't hard for me to think of songs that I knew he would know the lyrics to. And it was so delightful to see him start to move his lips to finish a phrase that I left
Amazing.
it dangling. Yes. What's been also amazing is for us as a Christian family, I've spoken scripture over him and done it so much repetitively that he has memorized it, and many, many verses now he'll say with me. And so I'm going to throw that in there as something that I think has been really helpful. It's caused him to hold things in his memory and also speak positive things into his life. Therapy, I love water therapy. It's been really wonderful for him to feel weightless, to be able to be moved. Sometimes he can do things in the water. Other days he's been exhausted, but she can really manipulate his body and get it more stretched out and more open. So I've tried things that I think are really helpful, like myofascial release, to help open up some of the tighter part of his. I can't explain it as well as the therapist, but it does kind of help take what's under the skin and over the muscle and kind of smooth that out and untangle this connective tissue that could be kind of constrictive. What other therapies? I think speech therapy has been fabulous and helpful. Sometimes speech therapy isn't what I would have expected it to be, but anything that's kind of working his cognitive abilities and his lips. I think just music, singing, humor.
Well, you're mentioning a lot of basically what ties to sensory motor stimulation. So we're talking about the brain does not work in isolation. I always like to mention, we used to think, with this little area responsible for this and this, and there are a few functions that are isolated to particular areas, and we'll know that if someone has a lesion in that area, they lose the complete capacity to do so. However, what we really know is that most functions in the brain occur in a variety of areas in the brain, and it's really a network. And so stimulation of particularly sensory, tactile, auditory, olfactory, auditory stimulation is extremely important, because that's how the brain learns, memorizes information, gets engaged, contemplates. That is how you see development in the brain. And so you want to engage all of those capacities and utilize them. Those are the tools the brain is using to develop information and process it. And so I think all of those, and that's why it is important to look at various kinds of therapies and somehow make that affordable for people. And that is the challenge.
Yes, I have a music therapist that is really working well with Ryan now, and she has him singing notes, specific notes, and has him drumming and getting rhythm back, helping him to stop hitting with the drum. That's as hard as getting him to do it on the beat,
start and
but
stop.
to just stop. So learning to edit and hold back is another area that you have to retrain.
Right.
We've had to retrain everything.
Structured and unstructured experiences. So it's quite fascinating. But it sounds like Ryan is growing and learning every day and making great strides. And I think that's very exciting, particularly that it's 14 years later and he's still changing.
He still is.
And I think that's exciting. And that is the power of magic of when you do see goodness in your life. So I think this is actually a very inspiring story. and we really appreciate all this information. I do want our listeners to actually perhaps just look at the pictures we've got here of Ryan. Maybe you can describe to us. So could we look at the first picture?
The first picture is Ryan at about 21 years old, strapping young man, 6'4", great looking, and he was just between junior college and getting ready to go to Pepperdine University. And I had a photographer come out and just take a nice headshot of him.
And the second picture?
That's the sad and tragic one. Probably a day or two after his accident, he was hooked up to every imaginable kind of machine to keep him alive and monitor everything in his body. This was months later. He'd lost about 50 pounds. He was so skinny, and he had a trach, he had a G-tube, he'd had his hair shaved off, and what's interesting is his hair just wasn't growing back because his body needed to do other things. That was not an essential. So his hair just stayed very short, and but he just kind of atrophied right before our eyes and couldn't talk, couldn't do anything. This was the saddest period of time.
And you did mention, and that's an important point, the body will do that. It will take care of what's important first for survival, often abandoning the secondary, third level of care, such as growing hair. And then later, when the body gets a handle on survival, it can pay attention to those. Tell us about your book just a little bit, and do we have that on? Great.
Well, this book is basically, I wrote it about 7 years after his accident, and it stayed in my computer for years. I didn't know what to do with it, but I knew I wanted to be able to have something eventually that I could share the lessons, because as I prayed in that airplane, as I was scribbling my prayer down on that airplane, I said, God, please don't let this pain be for no reason. And as I walked through this very dark time in my life, I felt definitely lessons were being learned. And I wanted to be able to be helpful to others going through it. So I kept my journals, and I started to read through my journals, and I told the story the best I could, and didn't know how to get it published. But eventually, as I took a step to self-publish, right at that point, somebody came into my life that kind of said, I think you should go the traditional route. And I said I would if I knew how, but he said, well, I'll help you. And he helped me get a co-author to my book who really fleshed out the story, because I wasn't talking about myself at all in my story. This was about Ryan. But she thought the publishers would want to have a little background on being a boon and growing up as a boon. So there's some of that in that book. But then it talks about Ryan, what kind of a young man he was, what a stellar human being. He was engaged, about to be married. He'd just graduated college, just launching out in his career. So I tell that part of the story, and then the accident, and then the lessons along the way. And hopefully, and I've been told it's been a great help to people that are maybe going through brain injury and sometimes just life. And hopefully it's been good for a lot of people. So if we can be a blessing to others, it helps us heal.
Absolutely. And it is commendable that you were able to do that. We don't expect people to focus so much on other people's journeys when they go through something like this. But the fact that you found the internal strength and connection with God to be able to find that energy inside you to go ahead and do that for other people is such a great example, and I think an inspiration for a lot of people. And we would like to perhaps have visually the link to rynsreach.com. Thank you. And please go ahead and find the time to check out the website, look at the great services that are growing and being offered to families who truly do, many of them do struggle finding funding to care for their loved one and provide the necessary services long term. And small donations work. So whatever you can.
They add up.
They add up. So whatever you find in you how to donate, please do consider doing so. If you have any questions, concerns, or you have individuals who need of help, there is a contact link on the website. You can reach out to the contact page and reach out to Ryan's Reach. With that in mind, I really wanted to thank you, Lindy, for taking the time to do this interview today.
My honor.
And educating our listeners. This This is absolutely our pleasure. With that in mind, hopefully you will only know blessings
Thank
for
you.
you and your family and your wonderful family and Ryan. And to you, the listeners, may you only know blessings and find ways to help others, bless others, and may you have a beautiful and uplifting coming week.
In the future, talk radio will actually educate, inspire, and make you think. The future is now. Topics